Good morning again. I'm John. If you don't know who I am, I'm one of the ministers here. We're glad to have you here with us this morning. On this Palm Sunday, it's the beginning of Holy Week, the week leading up to Easter, and we're very excited to be celebrating together. Today, we've got some other things coming up later this week that we're excited to do as well, and then hopefully to be back here again next week for Easter Sunday. I got to be honest, I have been in church since I was very, very little. My dad was a preacher. We lived in the parsonage, which was like less than a quarter mile from the church. So we were there anytime the doors were open. As soon as I was old enough to go unlock the building by myself, that became like my job. They're like, hey, someone's got to do something at church. Take the keys, go unlock it for them. So I was there all the time. For years and years and years and years. And still, after all that time, I don't know what to do with Palm Sunday. I don't know what it is about it the week before Easter. It's kind of a strange story, which we'll look at here in a little bit. But I'm never quite sure what to do. And Jim asked, it's a month or two ago, we have the kind of sermon series lined out on the board, looking each week what we're going to do. And we just got done with a series called Vision 360, where we talked about what it means to follow Jesus, not just on Sunday morning, but what would that look like if we invited Jesus into different areas of our lives, into our homes, into our work, and all these different places. And then we have the series beginning technically next week, the This Is Love series going through the next 3 weeks, Easter and the couple weeks afterwards. And we had this one kind of week hanging out in the middle, and Jim was like, hey, do you want to do that one, that Palm Sunday? I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. I got to tell you, I wish I hadn't said that. Because if I'd have been thinking about it, I would realize that's Palm Sunday. I don't know what to do with Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is just kind of weird. It's a weird story. And it kind of falls in between. I guess it's a good reminder that Easter is next week, so it has that purpose. It's a reminder, the story, as we'll see, is kind of a reminder of how fickle and two-faced people can be. We have people shouting, Hosanna, blessed is the King, that a couple days later are going to shout, crucify him, give us Barabbas. And it's kind of... well, how do I put this? Coming from a non-liturgical church, so a church that doesn't tend to do a lot of the kind of traditional celebrations, things like Good Friday services or Maundy, Thursday, or all these other things that come during Holy Week. The habit is sometimes to skip Good Friday. We love Palm Sunday. It's very celebratory. It's exciting. And we love Easter, which is a great celebration of the resurrection. And we can forget that there's some fairly important things that happen between those two things. We like the celebration, but we miss the cross, which is really important. So normally, it's my habit on a Palm Sunday, say, let's just forget the palm fronds and the weird parade, and let's talk about the crucifixion. But we have something for that this week. We have coming up on Friday, the building will be open, the other end of the building I'll be setting up today from 12 to 4. You can come in at any point and kind of walk through that week, the last few days of Jesus' life, and pray through those things and experience those things and be reminded of those things as we prepare to celebrate for Easter. So I couldn't do that today, and yet I said, yes, I don't. So we have a new series starting next week, Jim says. It's called This Is Love. Next week and the 2 weeks following, and it's a reminder on Easter and the weeks following of the love that God showed us through the death of his son, what it means that there is a love that forgives sin, what it means that there is a love that conquers death, what it means that there's a love that makes all things new. And so because I wasn't sure what else to do, and as I read the Gospels, especially Luke this week, I decided to steal Jim's sermon series. It's the only appropriate thing to do, really. So Jim's 3-week series is now a 4-week series that starts today. Sorry, buddy. And we're going to talk about a love that shows up. So I'm going to read a story for us from the Gospel of Luke. If you have the Bible app, the YouVersion, you can pull that up, and the text will be in there if you look at events. Luke chapter 19, I guess, yeah, if you have a Bible, you could look in Luke also. Luke chapter 19 starts about in the middle of that chapter, verse 28. And the story goes like this. After he had said this, he went on ahead. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it, just say, the Lord needs it. Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, why are you untying the colt? They replied, the Lord needs it. They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. And when he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles that they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. I tell you, he replied, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. And as he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city, and he wept over it. And he said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. That's a weird story. I mean, there's so many things in there that are just kind of head scratchers. Jesus sends his disciples and says, hey, go into town, steal someone's donkey. It'll be fine. They won't. It'll be fine. And then he rides it into town. It's not terribly spectacular either when you think about it. I mean, as far as headlines go, if you read the Gospel of Luke, Jesus starts traveling towards Jerusalem in chapter 9. He spends about 10 chapters walking there. So, I mean, man goes to Jerusalem, decides not to walk for the last few miles. So it's like, this is not particularly spectacular. And it can't have been a terribly enormous spectacle. I mean, the Pharisees noticed, but they were watching Jesus all the time. They're just trying to, waiting for him to do something wrong. The Romans couldn't have noticed, because if the Romans had noticed someone triumphantly marching into one of their cities, things would not have gone very well. And even if every single person in Jerusalem was lying in the streets yelling, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the King, on that Sunday, we'll see as the story goes on that they're going to yell other things in 5 or 6 days. So what's the big deal? What's the impact? What difference does this story make? I mean, I've heard this story dozens of times, and I don't know what to make of it. But as I read it this week, a couple of times, I read it from Mark earlier in the week, and I read it from Luke later. Something did stand out to me that I want us to think about this morning just for a little bit. And that's just this simple observation, I guess. Jesus shows up. Jesus knows what is going to happen to him in Jerusalem. If you read the story, if you read Luke, even if you're not familiar with the gospel story, Jesus tells you over and over in that story as it goes, what's going to happen to him when he gets to Jerusalem. Jesus is a prophet in the book of Luke, and Jesus tells you what happens to prophets in Jerusalem. He knows. He's been trying to tell his disciples for about 10 chapters, and he's not even being like coy or sneaky about it. There's no parables. He just says, the Son of Man must undergo suffering and be rejected and be killed, and on the third day rise again. This is not rocket. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. So he knows what is going to happen when he gets there, and he goes anyways. He shows up anyways. There's a story in the Gospel of John, that's chapter 13, when Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples. So this would be a couple days after he's marched into Jerusalem. And one of the coolest things about that story, it's the story where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. But at the very beginning of that story, it says that Jesus knows 3 things. It said he knew that his time had come. And he knew that God had given him all power over everything. And he knew the one that was going to betray him. And knowing all these things, he shows up. He shows up anyways. He loves anyways. That chapter goes on to say, loving those who were his own, he showed them the full extent of his love. Jesus shows up. He knows what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. He knows that it means suffering and rejection. He knows that it will ultimately mean his death. And so, in the middle of all of that, in the middle of the mess, in the middle of the hurt, in the middle of the need, Jesus shows up. Because that's what love does. Love shows up. And as I read this story a couple times this week and kind of looking past the parades and looking past the Psalms and looking past the irritated Pharisees and the weird prophetic things, what I saw this week in this story is that Jesus shows up, that love shows up. And if we want to be disciples, like we've spent the last 6 or so weeks talking about, if we want to continue asking ourselves what kind of steps do we need to take to be more committed to following Jesus, what might it look like for us to follow Jesus outside of this building in our regular lives, at home, at work, and all these other places, we also need to show up. It's not rocket science, but it's important. People really don't understand Jesus. People in the Gospels, most of the people in the Gospel story. If you read the Gospels, you'll see all kinds of people just getting Jesus very, very wrong. They're not sure what to do with him. They're not sure what to think about him. But he's been about this whole showing up for people thing the whole time. The first sermon Jesus ever preaches in the Gospel of Luke, he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, and he's here to proclaim good news to the poor, and freedom for the captives, and recovery of sight for the blind," and all of these types of things. And people hear that first sermon, and they're like, wow, he's really onto something. And then at the tail end of that sermon, he says, hey, guess what? God's here to show up not just for you all, but for people who aren't like you. And they chase him out of town and try to throw him off a cliff. They just don't get it. They miss the point. I take the disciples for an example. I don't want to dog on the disciples because they do get a lot of things right, and we are here because they're eventually faithful. And this is the only reason we have these stories. But take them for example. What do they do when Jesus tells them, I'm going to suffer and be rejected and die? They start to argue about who's going to take his place. Which one of us is the most important? Because if he's gone, one of us has got to take over. They argue about who's going to sit at his right and left hand when he finally comes into his glory. They think eventually he's got to turn it on, and he's going to kick some tail, and he's going to be on a throne somewhere. And when that happens, we are going to be there. He's going to remember that we were still there when he was a little guy. They argue about who's the most important. They miss it. And if we want to be like Jesus, we can't be concerned with our prominence, with our greatness, with where we're going to fit in the hierarchy of his kingdom. We just need to show up. The Gospels all tell a story. It's the one miracle that's in all the Gospels, that Jesus miraculously feeds 5,000 people. And the stories are a little bit different in every version. There's little details that are slightly different. But at the start of all the stories, they start very similarly. The disciples are sitting there. They're surrounded by all these hungry people. And they say, Lord, send these people away. We can't feed them all. They have to go away and deal with it. They see hunger. They see this crowd in need. And their first response to this problem, which they definitively see as a problem and not their problem, is let's get rid of these people. Send them off so we can get off to the important things. They see the need, and they just don't get it. They don't understand what Jesus is about. They don't yet understand that following Jesus means being there for people in their need. Showing up, not sending them away, not turning around. You show up. Matthew and Mark write just within a couple chapters of telling the story of feeding the 5,000. They tell another story where Jesus miraculously feeds 4,000 people. And it boggles my mind that in that story, with 1,000 fewer people, they say, Lord, where are we going to get food to feed all these people? We should send them away. And Jesus says, well, how much food do you have? And they have more than they did the first time. And they just don't get it. They still don't understand. Luke doesn't tell the second story, but you know what story Luke does tell? And this is also crazy to me. That Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's just started to head towards Jerusalem near the end of chapter 9. And they are moving through this town, and they're going to stay there, but the people there don't really want them to stay. They're Samaritans, and if you don't know, Jesus and his Jewish disciples and the Samaritan people, the Jews and Samaritans don't really get along. There's a long history there we're not going to get into today, because I love history lessons. But I won't do that to you. And his disciples, the same disciples who were like, we can't feed people miraculously, send them away. Do you know what they ask? James and John, some of Jesus' closest followers, say, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to kill these people? They don't get it. The same people who are like, we couldn't possibly feed all these people who are in need, say, God could miraculously kill these people who we don't like. They don't get it. All of this time following Jesus, and they don't understand that what Jesus is about, especially in Luke, is showing up. Showing up for people who are in need, showing up for people who are hurting, showing up for people who are not like you, but showing up. And the Gospels are full. There's story after story after story of Jesus trying to teach this to his disciples. And we could go through a lot of them, but we just don't have the time. He says, what if there was someone hurt along the road? And do we just cross to the other side and walk on our way because we might become unclean or something else is more important? Or do we stop and invest in them? Do we show up for that person? He tells the parable, which we know is the Good Samaritan. Very shortly after that, he tells another parable where he talks about this rich man who lives in luxury and ignores the person who's in pain and suffering and hungry that's sitting at his doorstep. You need to show up. And he tries to teach him, and he tries to teach him, and he tries to teach him, and then he does it. Because love shows up. And that's what I've learned this week from the Palm Sunday story. Among all the other things going on, all of the palm branches waving and the coats on the ground and the weird stolen donkey and the parade, that love shows up. And it does it without fanfare. It does it without self-centeredness. It does it in the face of suffering and rejection. Knowing that it would mean his death, Jesus shows up. And if we want to be like Jesus, if that's what we're here for, and that's what we say we're here for, then we need to show up. Love shows up. And I don't mean show up here on Sunday morning. I mean show up for people in the midst of their hurt and their troubles and their mess. And God, are they messy. We're messy. But you show up anyways. Luke has a lot more stories about this, but I'm going to tell you two quick stories that aren't from the Gospel of Luke. They're from John, not the Gospel of me. It took you a minute. See what I did there? Jim has his dad jokes. It's fine. Everything's fine. So a lot of you are probably aware on Monday there was a shooting in Tennessee at a school. And I brought Ian to school the next day, and I hate doing that. It's one of my least favorite things. And it is, by my count, the 90th time I've had to do that. And he's in first grade. And one of the first times, maybe not the first time, but one of the first times there was a shooting at a school in Michigan. Some friends of mine are on staff there, and so it felt particularly close. And I had to bring Ian to school the next day, and I got in the line, and there was a police officer in the parking lot, and I got here to the office. And I texted the elders and Jim, and I said, hey, guys, God, this isn't even the hard story. Oh, this is going to be a mess. I said, hey, I just want you, if you guys have the time today, I could really use some prayers, because it's tough. I'm having a rough day. I don't want my kid to be at school. I want to go and get him and just sit at my house with him and tell him that he's safe and nothing bad's going to happen to him. And it's tough. It's hard, and today is it kind of sucks. And they all, texted back, we're praying for you, and it was great. And then at lunchtime, I'm not going to look at him. He's like right here. I'll just try to avoid eye contact. I hear the doors open. I'm in my office. I hear the doors beep, and Craig Lee came in. I thought maybe he was coming to change the sign or something. He does that sort of thing. And he stopped him off and said, hey, John, I was on my lunch break, and I just thought I would stop by and pray with you. Not because he knew eventually it would become a sermon illustration, and not because he got anything out of it, but because love shows up. That is what you do. You show up for people that are hurting, and I appreciate Craig so much. I appreciate all the leaders here, but that means and meant so much to me. Oh man, this one's going to be a doozy. That's one story. Love shows up. The other one, I really don't like to tell, and sometimes I wonder why I do, but I'll tell you why I do. So my wife and I lost a child. Some of you may or may not know that, before our son was born. And I like to tell the story for a couple reasons. One, because losing kids and miscarriages aren't something people talk about. And so when it happens to you, it can feel very isolating and make you feel very lonely because you don't know that other people have gone through it. And so if all this accomplishes is someone else has gone through it and knows someone that can relate, that's great. But I also tell this story because I think it's important to remind people what it looks like when we're faithful, when we act like Jesus. So here it goes. We'll see if I can do it. Right before Ian was born, about a year, we had a miscarriage. It was end of the summer, it's around Labor Day weekend. And we'd already told a few people, our friends and family, that we were expecting. It was within the first 12 weeks. It's pretty normal. But at that point, we didn't think, oh yeah, this is pretty normal. We weren't thinking, oh yeah, 1 in 4 pregnancies, this happens. And so I guess we were devastated. It was the worst. There are scriptures that I still have a hard time reading because of that, and it was 8 or 9 years ago. Things like, your child is dead, don't bother the teacher any longer, is a scripture from the Gospels I have a hard time reading. There's another one that says, let the little children come to me and forbid them not. And that is hard for me to read, thinking about that loss. But it was tough. I went to our minister's house at the time, and we spent some time together. And then that evening, the first evening we were home, we had a knock on the door. My wife and I were just sitting at home. And I'm really super glad that he's not here, because this would be even harder if he was. Jameson Higgins and his wife Joanna are very good friends of ours. They just moved back into town. They were here at Lakeshore for quite a while. So they showed up. And Jameson, if you know him, he's a big guy, and he comes in with this box. I'm just a huge box. And it had everything in it. It had movies, every kind of movie you could think of. It had snacks. It had sweet snacks. It had salty snacks. It had like ice cream and chips and like chick flicks and action movies. It was the most ridiculous box of random stuff I've ever seen in my life. And he walks into our house with this box, and all he said was, I didn't know what to bring. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what was in the box because he showed up. They showed up. Love shows up. That's what it does. And that's what this story reminds us of, among other things. I needed Jesus to show up. Look, both of those stories and a number of other times in my life, I have needed Jesus to show up, and he did. Once he looked a lot like Craig Lee. And once he looked a lot like a big dude carrying a box full of random stuff. And countless other times it's looked like countless other people who decided that they were going to take this Christianity thing seriously and show up when someone was hurting. I needed Jesus to show up, and there he was. So if Palm Sunday reminds us of anything today, certainly I want it to remind us that Jesus is King. And we will sing again in a little while and celebrate and remember that. And certainly it can remind us of all kinds of other things. But this week, maybe today, I hope it reminds you that that's what love is. Love shows up. Jesus did it. Jesus calls us to do it. Now let's pray together. My nose is literally dripping, so I'm gonna have to walk over and I'm gonna get on this microphone, and I just thank you so much. Whew. Allergy season, am I right? That'll be fine. It's not on camera. Why don't we're gonna pray together, and then we're gonna spend some time in worship again. We're going to spend some time in communion. One of the things I love about this time, about the time when we are able to remember the cross, remember Jesus' body, and remember his blood, is it is a reminder every week that Jesus shows up. He showed up that week in Jerusalem, knowing what would happen. He shows up in our lives in any number of ways. We serve a God who is faithful, who has always showed up, who will always show up. And so we're going to sing a couple songs in a minute that remind us of those things. We will take communion together to remind us of that and carry on. But let's pray before we do that, and we'll carry on.